In 1966, a century-old titan vanished. They survived the horse and buggy era and 2 world wars, yet one fatal boardroom decision turned their car of the future into the industry's most expensive ghost story.
The irony of excellence. Success in the American automotive industry is usually measured in horsepower, chrome, and quarterly dividends. But for one company, success was measured in centuries. Before Ford, before General Motors, and long before Chrysler was even a blueprint, there was Studebaker. Most people think of Studebaker as a quirky alternative car company from the 1950s, the ones who made the cars that looked like they were driving backward. But that's the tragedy. By the time they reached their final days, Studebaker wasn't just a car company, it was a piece of American DNA. They were the only manufacturer in history to successfully transition from horse-drawn wagons to gasoline-powered engines. So how does a company that conquered the 19th century and pioneered the 20th century find itself flat broke, abandoned, and forgotten by 1966? To understand the fall, we have to understand the height of the pedestal they fell from. The Wagon Kings. The story begins in 1852. Two brothers, Henry and Clement Studebaker, opened a blacksmith shop in South Bend, Indiana, with just $68 and a set of tools. They weren't building cars, they were building the vehicles that built the West. If you were a pioneer crossing the Great Plains in a covered wagon, chances are you were riding in a Studebaker. By the time the American Civil War broke out, Studebaker was the primary supplier of wagons for the Union Army. They were the Boeing of their day. Their reputation was built on a single, unbreakable rule: always give more than you promise. The pivot to petrol. In the early 1900s, when the internal combustion engine began to rattle the streets, most wagon makers laughed. They thought the automobile was a noisy toy for the rich. But Studebaker was different. They saw the writing on the wall. They didn't just survive the transition, they dominated it. By the 1920s, they were a powerhouse. Their engines were legendary for endurance. In 1927, they took a stock car to the Atlantic City Speedway and ran it for 25,000 miles at an average speed of 60 miles per hour. In an era where most cars broke down going to the grocery store, this was unheard of. But this obsession with over-engineering and giving more than promised would eventually become the very noose that strangled them. The post-war illusion. Fast forward to 1946. World War II has just ended. Every soldier coming home wants a house in the suburbs and a shiny new car in the driveway. The big three, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, are still scrambling to convert their factories back from tank production to car production. Studebaker saw their opening. They beat everyone to the punch. In 1947, they released the Starlight Coupe. It was revolutionary. It featured a wraparound rear window that looked like a cockpit. It was sleek, it was futuristic, and it sold like wildfire. For a brief moment, it looked like Studebaker wasn't just going to survive the post-war era, they were going to lead it. But behind the gleaming chrome and the record-breaking sales of 1950, a rot was starting to set in. A rot that started in the accounting department and ended on the assembly line. The cost of being the nice guy. While Ford and GM were cutthroat, Studebaker was a family company. Their labor costs in South Bend were the highest in the industry. They paid their workers more and demanded less automation. In 1950, while the rest of the world was looking at Studebaker as a success story, the company was actually losing money on every car they sold because their break-even point was impossibly high. They needed to sell nearly 250,000 cars a year just to stay in the black. To put that in perspective, in their best year ever, they barely cleared that. They were running a marathon at a sprint pace, and their lungs were starting to burn. Then came 1953, the year the Big Three decided to start a war, and Studebaker was caught in the crossfire.
The perfect storm. If 1950 was the peak, 1953 was the beginning of the freefall. Studebaker was about to learn a hard lesson. In the car business, being a visionary is only profitable if your factory can actually build your vision. Enter Raymond Loewy. He was the father of industrial design, the man who gave us the Coca-Cola bottle and the Lucky Strike pack. He wanted to give Studebaker a car that looked like it belonged on the streets of Paris, not just the suburbs of Indiana. The result was the 1853 Bourgeois and Starlight coupes. They were low, wide, and incredibly European. Today, collectors call them some of the most beautiful cars ever made. But in 1853, beauty was a curse. The production disaster. The design was so radical that Studebaker's aging tooling in South Bend couldn't handle it. The front sheet metal didn't fit the chassis. The flex in the frame was so bad that if you jacked up the car to change a tire, the doors wouldn't open, or worse, they'd pop open while you were driving. Studebaker had 100,000 orders for the new coupe. People were lining up with cash in hand. But because of production delays, the company couldn't ship the cars. By the time the quality issues were fixed, the new car smell of the 1953 season had evaporated. Customers got tired of waiting and walked across the street to the Ford or Chevy dealership. Studebaker lost the most important sales year of the decade. And they didn't just lose sales, they lost the trust of their dealers. The Ford-GM price war. While Studebaker was struggling with door gaps and frame flex, a titan was waking up. Henry Ford II was tired of being second to General Motors. In 1953 and 1954, Ford launched an all-out blitz. They flooded the market with cars, slashing prices to levels that barely turned a profit, all to steal market share from GM. GM, with its massive bank accounts, fought back. They lowered prices even further. But for the independents, Studebaker, Hudson, Nash, and Packard, this was a death sentence. They didn't have the economy of scale to survive a price war. It cost Studebaker $3,600 to build a car that Ford could build for $3,100. When Ford dropped their price to $3,200, Studebaker was forced to choose, sell at a massive loss or don't sell at all. By 1954, Studebaker was bleeding $20 million a year. The Wagon Kings were running out of road. The merger of the desperate. The industry experts had a solution: merge. If the small guys joined forces, maybe they could stand up to the big three. In 1954, Studebaker merged with Packard. On paper, it looked like a dream team. Studebaker was the high-volume, everyman brand. Packard was the ultimate American luxury icon, the car of kings and presidents. But the merger was built on a lie. James Nance, the head of Packard, was told that Studebaker's break-even point was 165,000 cars. After the papers were signed, he discovered the truth. Studebaker's actual break-even point was closer to 250,000. Studebaker hadn't just been struggling, they were a financial black hole. Packard, which was still profitable at the time, was essentially tricked into tying itself to a sinking ship. Instead of two strong companies becoming one powerhouse, it was two drowning men grabbing each other's necks. The last stand of the Lark. By 1958, the Packard name was dead. The luxury line had been reduced to Packard Bakers, Studebaker cars with Packard badges glued on. It was an embarrassment to the legacy. Studebaker was down to its last few $1 million. They had one shot left. They looked at the market and saw that Americans were starting to get tired of the chrome dinosaurs that were getting bigger and thirstier every year. They decided to go small. They took their existing full-size car, chopped the front and back off, and called it the Lark. It was the first modern American compact. It was simple, honest, and affordable. And for one miraculous year in 1959, it worked. Studebaker turned a $28 million profit. The factory in South Bend was humming again. For a moment, the ghost of Henry and Clement Studebaker seemed to be smiling. But the big three were watching, and they didn't like what they saw. The ghost in the machine. Success in the car industry is a moving target. In 1959, Studebaker hit the bullseye with the Lark. They had the compact market all to themselves. But in Detroit, the big three were not sleeping. They were retooling. In 1960, the year of the compact arrived. Ford released the Falcon, Chevrolet released the Corvair, Plymouth released the Valiant. These weren't just cars, they were backed by the largest marketing budgets in human history. Studebaker's Lark went from being the only game in town to being the underdog overnight. Sales plummeted by 25%. The $28 million profit from the year before evaporated into a $14 million loss. The message from Detroit was clear. We let you play for a year, now get out of our sandbox. The boardroom betrayal. Inside the Studebaker boardroom in South Bend, the atmosphere had turned cold. The directors weren't car guys anymore, they were diversification guys. They looked at the automotive division as a dying limb. To save the body, they started buying other companies, non-automotive companies. They bought Gravely tractors, STP oil additives, and even a company that made floor polishers. They were using the profits from their other divisions to keep the car company on life support, but they weren't investing in the cars themselves. While GM was building high-tech overhead cam engines, Studebaker was still using engine blocks designed in the 1940s. Then, in 1961, a man named Sherwood Egbert was hired as president. He was a Marine, a powerhouse of a man, who actually wanted to save the car division. He looked at the boring, dated lineup and said, "We need a hero." The birth of the Avanti, the plastic miracle. Egbert did something crazy. He called Raymond Loewy again and told him to design a sports car, not in months, but in weeks. Loewy and his team holed up in a house in Palm Springs. In just 40 days, they created the Studebaker Avanti. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It had no grille, just a smooth, aerodynamic nose. It had a built-in roll bar, bucket seats, and a supercharged engine that could hit 170 miles per hour. It was the fastest production car in the world at the time. It broke 29 world speed records at the Bonneville Salt Flats. But there was a problem. Studebaker was so broke, they couldn't afford to build the car out of steel. The curves were too complex for their old stamping machines, so they made the body out of fiberglass. The production curse strikes again. The Avanti was supposed to be the halo car that saved the brand. People flocked to the showrooms, but the fiberglass supplier, the same company that made the Corvette bodies, couldn't get the parts right. The panels didn't fit, the glass cracked. Thousands of orders were canceled. By the time the production issues were fixed in late 1963, the momentum was dead. The Avanti, a car that looked like it was from the year 2000, was being built in a factory that felt like 1910. The secret decision, December 1963. While the public saw the beautiful Avanti on magazine covers, the board of directors had seen enough. On a cold day in December 1963, they made the decision that would shatter the city of South Bend. They decided to stop all automotive production in the United States. The news was a gut punch to the 7,000 workers who had spent generations at the plant. In South Bend, you didn't just work for Studebaker, your father worked there, and your grandfather worked there. The company had survived the Great Depression without a single layoff. Now, the wagon kings were packing their bags. But the story doesn't end there. In a move that confused the entire industry, Studebaker didn't die completely. They moved what was left of the company to a small plant in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. The Common Sense Era, 1964 to 1966. The Canadian operation was a skeleton crew. They stopped making their own engines and started buying them from their rivals Chevrolet. They stopped making the Avanti and the trucks. They focused on one thing, a simple, boring, sensible car for people who just wanted a Studebaker. They called it the Common Sense car. But in the 1960s, a decade defined by the Mustang, the GTO, and the muscle car revolution, common sense was the last thing people wanted to buy. Studebaker was now a zombie brand. It was moving, but it had no soul. The dealers were jumping ship. The public knew the end was near. Why buy a car from a company that might not exist by the time you need an oil change? The final breath and the post-mortem. By 1964, Studebaker was a ghost haunting its own showrooms. The move to Canada was sold to the public as a streamlining move, a way to become a lean, mean, profitable boutique automaker. But in reality, it was a slow-motion liquidation. The company had stopped innovating. They were no longer the wagon kings or the creators of the Starlight Coupe. They were a company assembly packaging Chevrolet engines into bodies that were essentially a decade old. The last of the breed. In 1852, they started with a blacksmith's hammer. In 1966, it ended with a quiet click of a camera. On March 4, 1966, the last Studebaker ever built rolled off the line in Hamilton, Ontario. It was a Timberline turquoise cruiser, a sensible four-door sedan. There was no parade, there were no flashing lights, just a group of weary workers standing around a car that represented the end of a 114-year-old American dream. That car didn't go to a dealership. It went straight to the company museum. It was an artifact before the paint was even dry. The Vulture Era. So if the car division died in 1966, why do we still see the Studebaker name through the 1970s? This is the cold, hard truth of corporate American history. Studebaker didn't go bankrupt in the traditional sense. The corporation was actually doing okay because they had diversified. They owned STP, they owned Gravely, they owned tire companies. The board of directors realized that the Studebaker name and its automotive losses were actually valuable tax write-offs. They kept the corpse of the car company alive just long enough to offset the profits of their other successful businesses. To the enthusiasts, this was the ultimate betrayal. The company that built the wagons for the Union Army and the trucks that won World War II was being used as a tax shield by accountants. The post-mortem. Why did they really fail? When we look back at the wreckage of Studebaker, it's easy to blame one thing, but the truth is, it was a death by 1,000 cuts. If you want to get 30K views on a video like this, you have to answer the question, could they have been saved? Let's look at the 4 pillars of their collapse. The labor trap. Studebaker was too nice. By paying the highest wages in the industry in an aging, inefficient factory, they ensured that they could never compete with the ruthless efficiency of Henry Ford II or the massive scale of GM. They were a 19th century family business trying to survive in a 20th century Shark Tank. The engineering paradox. They were too far ahead or too far behind. They gave us the Avanti, a car 20 years ahead of its time, but they gave it to us with a suspension designed in the 1940s. They had the vision of geniuses, but the budget of beggars. The merger from hell. The Packard merger was the final nail. Instead of bringing in new capital, it brought in more debt and a dying luxury brand that confused the market. It was 2 people who couldn't swim trying to save each other by holding on to a lead weight. The loss of identity. In their final years, Studebaker forgot what they were. They weren't common-sense cars, they were the innovators. When they stopped being the different choice and started trying to be a cheap Chevy, they gave the public no reason to buy them. The legacy of the Avanti. Ironically, the car that failed to save them, the Avanti, refused to die. When Studebaker shut down, a group of enthusiasts and dealers bought the tooling and the space in the South Bend factory. They continued to build the Avanti by hand for decades. It became the ultimate cult classic. It proved that the spirit of Studebaker, the desire to be radical, beautiful, and different, was what people actually loved. If the board of directors had leaned into that spirit instead of trying to play it safe, perhaps the Studebaker badge would still be on our roads today. The final lesson. Studebaker's story is a warning to every giant. No matter how deep your roots go, no matter if you built the wagons that crossed the frontier or the cars that defined the 50s, you are only as good as your next move. The wagon kings survived the horse, the steam engine, and the Great Depression. but they couldn't survive the loss of their own soul. When the lights went out in South Bend, it wasn't just a factory closing. It was the end of an era where a small, independent company from Indiana could tell the giants in Detroit how the future should look. Today, the South Bend factory is mostly gone. The test track is an overgrown forest. But every time you see a car with a daring design or a company that dares to challenge the status quo, you're seeing a little bit of the Studebaker ghost. They gave more than they promised, until they had nothing left to give.